He grabbed the music box right out of that little girl's hands. Didn't fumble it. Didn't bump it by accident. He grabbed it, looked straight at the child, looked straight at her mother, and let it drop onto the marble floor like it was trash. The sound it made when it shattered that hollow, ceramic crack bounced off every wall in that corridor. Shoppers stopped walking. A woman nearby covered her mouth. The little girl froze, her face going from confusion to devastation in about 2 seconds flat. And the man who did it? He laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not the awkward kind people do when they've done something they regret. He laughed, deep, deliberate, the kind that says, I can do this, and there is nothing you can do about it. What kind of man does that to a child's birthday present? And what kind of woman could stand in the middle of a packed Manhattan shopping mall, humiliated in front of strangers, and not break? You're about to find out. If this was you, if someone looked at your life, your body, your history, and decided you were beneath them, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay down, and I don't want you to miss a single one. And while you're at it, drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that mall. Because what happened next changed everything. The morning had started the way most of Zariah's Saturday mornings. Started with Nyla pulling the covers off her at 7:15 and announcing that she was hungry, that the cereal was gone, and that she had already decided what she wanted for breakfast, even though nobody had asked her. Waffles, as Nyla said, standing at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed and one sock on, with the strawberries, not the frozen ones. Zariah had opened one eye. Good morning to you too. Good morning. Waffles, please. She was 8 years old and had been living with Zariah for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had developed opinions about approximately everything breakfast, the correct way to fold towels, which side of the elevator you were supposed to stand on, and why Saturdays should never be wasted on errands. Zariah loved every exhausting inch of it. She made the waffles. She cut the real strawberries. She watched Nyla eat with the focused intensity of a child who had learned early on that meals were not guaranteed things, and who still, even now, in this safe and warm kitchen, cleaned her plate like someone might take it away. Some habits don't leave children just because their circumstances improve. Zariah knew that. She'd had a few of those habits herself. After breakfast, Nyla reminded her for the 4th time that week that her best friend Amara's birthday party was in 6 days, and that she needed a music box. Not just any music box. A carousel music box with horses. That actually spun. I saw it online, Nyla said, carrying her plate to the sink the way Zariah had taught her. It plays music when you open it. I know, baby. You showed me. You said we'd get it this Saturday. I know, today is Saturday. Zariah dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at her daughter, this small, serious, beautiful child who had come into her life through grief and stayed through love. And she thought, not for the first time, that whatever she had done to deserve this particular person, she was grateful for it every single day. Go put your shoes on, she said. Nyla was already halfway down the hall. The mall was one of those places that tried to be something more than a mall-high ceilings. Italian marbles, floors, stores where the salespeople wore all black and spoke in murmurs. The kind of place that made you feel like you needed to justify your presence just by walking through the door. Zariah had never been entirely comfortable there. She went because Nyla's music box was sold at one of the boutique toy stores on the 3rd level, and because the alternative was a 2-hour online shipping wait that Nyla's patience could not survive. They found the music box. It was small and white and painted with tiny horses in gold and blue, and when Zariah lifted the lid to show Nyla, a delicate 3-note melody began turning in the cylinder, and Nyla pressed both hands to her cheeks and said, "That's the one." The woman behind the counter wrapped it in tissue paper, and then in a small box, and then in glossy birthday wrap with a ribbon curled at the top. Nyla held it with both hands all the way to the elevator. She was still holding it when they came around the corner near the atrium and walked directly into Derek Halston. Zariah felt it before she processed it, that particular stillness that happens when your body recognizes something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. Like a drop in air pressure before a storm. She stopped walking for just a fraction of a second, and that half second was enough for Nyla to bump gently into her side and look up. You okay? Yes, Zariah said. And then she kept walking. Because what else do you do? Derek hadn't changed much. A little heavier in the face. Better dressed. He had the practiced ease of a man who had spent several years cultivating the appearance of someone whose money was old, even though his was not. He was standing with a woman tall, blonde, wearing something that cost more than Zariah's first apartment, and two other men in expensive jackets who had the look of associates, who thought of themselves as friends. He didn't see Zariah at first, and for about 4 seconds, she thought they were going to walk past each other like strangers, which was exactly what they were, and that would be the end of it. Then he saw her. The recognition moved across his face in stages. First, the double take, then the narrowing of his eyes as he placed her. Then, and this was the part that hit her in the sternum, the smile. Not surprise, not awkwardness. A smile. Like running into her was something that amused him. Zariah Monroe, he said. She didn't stop walking. Hey. He stepped slightly into her path, not blocking it entirely, just enough to make it clear that he expected her to stop. Zariah. She stopped. Not because she wanted to, because Nyla was beside her, and she wasn't going to pull her daughter into a collision or cause a scene in the middle of a crowded mall corridor if she could help it. She stopped, and she kept her expression neutral, and she said, Derek. Wow. He looked at her the way people look at things they find surprising in a way that entertains them, up and down slowly. It's been, what, 4 or 5 years? Something like that. You look, he tilted his head. His smile stayed. You look the same. It was delivered just precisely enough to land without being obviously cruel. You look the same. Not you look well. Not you look good. Just the same. A reminder. He hadn't forgotten what he thought of her. He just wanted her to know that whatever had happened in the years between, he still filed her in the same category. The woman beside him, his girlfriend, was watching with the politely masked expression of someone who sensed something was happening but didn't have the full context yet. Zariah said, Take care of yourself, and moved to step around him. You shopping alone? I'm with my daughter, she said. He glanced at Nyla. Nyla was looking up at him with the calm, evaluative stare that 8-year-olds deploy when they've learned to observe adults closely because adults are unpredictable. She was still holding the wrapped music box with both hands. Cute kid, he said, in exactly the way people say things they don't mean. Zariah said nothing. Where's your? He made a vague gesture. Husband? Boyfriend? Or is it just you two? And there it was. The reason for the smile. He hadn't run into her by accident and felt a complicated mix of old feelings. He had run into her and immediately begun calculating how to remind her of what she'd been and what, by his assessment, she probably still was. Single, struggling, unchanged. We're on our way out, she said. Right. He nodded, like she'd confirmed something he suspected. Still doing the whole independent thing. Good for you. The woman beside him laughed once. Quietly, not a mean laugh, more a surprised one. The kind you make when you're not sure what's funny, but someone you're with seems to think something is. Zariah took Nyla's hand. That was when Derek's eyes dropped to her left hand. He went still. Then he looked back up at her face, and for the first time since he'd spoken to her, the amusement slipped just slightly and something colder came through underneath. Is that a wedding ring? Zariah didn't answer. You're married? And now the smile came back, but it was different, sharper. Someone actually married you? The words went through the corridor the way a stone goes through still water, the immediate impact, and then the ripples spreading outward in every direction. A woman nearby glanced over. One of Derek's companions shifted his weight. His girlfriend's posture changed. Zariah felt Nyla's hand tighten around hers. She looked at Derek, and she said calmly, clearly, he saw what you never could. Something happened in his face when she said that. The smile flickered. She could see him deciding, in real time, whether to let it go or escalate. She could see the exact moment he chose escalation. Oh, that's great. He laughed. Good for you. Really, that's a nice little life you've got there. His eyes moved to Nyla again, and then to the wrapped gift she was holding. What's this? A present for someone? That's sweet. Derek, he reached out and took the music box from Nyla's hands. Not violently, not in a lunge. He just took it, with the casual entitlement of a man who had never, in his life, reached for something and been told no. Nyla made a small sound. Zariah said, "Give that back." He turned the box over in his hands, examining it the way you examine something meaningless. "Relax, I'm just looking." He read the ribbon, the wrapping. "Whoever wrapped this did a nice job. Little fancy for a kid's toy, isn't it? Give it back now." He looked at her, met her eyes, and then he opened his hand. The box hit the marble floor with a sound that stopped time. The ribbon unspooled. The corner of the wrapping crumpled inward. The box itself didn't shatter the music box inside, was protected enough for that, but the wrap was destroyed, the ribbon was ruined, and the gift that Nyla had held all the way across the mall with both hands was now lying on the floor of a public corridor, while the man who dropped it smiled. Nyla didn't cry. She was a child who had experienced things that had taught her that crying sometimes wasn't safe, so she didn't cry. She just looked at the box on the floor and then looked up at her mother, and her face, her small, composed, trying so hard face, said everything that her voice didn't. Zariah let go of her daughter's hand. She crouched down and picked up the gift, and she checked the corners and held it carefully, and then she stood back up, and she looked at Derek Halston, and she did not say one word. She didn't need to. What was on her face was not rage. It wasn't grief. It was something older and quieter than both of those things, and it was worse because of it. Derek Halston looked at her expression, and for just a moment, one single, involuntary moment, he looked uncertain. Then he recovered. Because men like Derek always recover. "You're being dramatic," he said. "It's a gift box." "It's fine." "Don't touch her again," Zariah said quietly. "Don't touch anything that belongs to us." For what? The uncertainty was gone. He stepped slightly closer. "What exactly are you going to do, Zariah? You going to call your husband? Is he even real? Or is that ring from a pawn?" He reached for her hand. She pulled it back. "I told you," she said. "Don't touch me. You need to calm down." He said it, the way men say it, when they want to be the one in control of what counts as calm. "You're making a scene." Around them, the corridor had acquired the electric stillness of a crowd that has collectively decided to watch. Shoppers had slowed. A store employee near the entrance was speaking quietly into a radio. 3 people had their phones out, though whether they were filming or just holding them was hard to say. Zariah was aware of all of it. She was also aware of Nyla, pressed slightly behind her hip, one hand gripping the back of her coat. She was aware that her heart was hammering, and that her hands were absolutely steady, and that somewhere in the 4 years since Derek had walked out of her life, telling her she was not enough, and would never be enough, she had apparently become someone who could stand in a marble corridor with a crushed birthday gift and a frightened child behind her and not fall apart. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. She didn't respond to him. She picked up the gift. She took Nyla's hand. She turned to walk away. Derek said behind her, loud enough that people around them could hear, "Nothing changes with some people. Doesn't matter who they marry." She kept walking. Nyla looked up at her. "Mama, are you okay? Is the music box broken?" Zariah checked it while they walked, carefully lifting the ribbon, pressing the corner of the box back into shape. The wrapping was unsalvageable. The box underneath seemed intact. She wouldn't know about the carousel inside until they opened it. "I don't know yet," she said. "What if it is?" Zariah looked at her daughter. "Then we'll fix it." What she didn't know, in that moment, was that something had already been set in motion that had nothing to do with her. Because 3 floors up, in the mall's private management suite, the head of security had been notified of a disturbance in the atrium corridor. And because the Davell family had standing arrangements with the management of several properties in Manhattan, arrangements made quietly and honored. Without exception, the security chief had made one phone call before dispatching anyone. The number he called connected to a man who had been Roman Davell's head of personal security for 11 years. That man had listened to the description. He had then called Roman. He kept the description factual. A man had spoken to Mrs. Davell, had handled property belonging to their daughter, had touched Mrs. Davell's hand after being told not to. Roman had not asked questions. He had said 3 words. "Where is she?" He was already moving when the answer came. Roman Davell was not a man who made entrances. He had never needed to. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been described, at various times, as striking, severe, and in certain New York circles, as the last thing you wanted to see when you'd done something wrong. He wore a dark coat. He had no visible security with him, which meant his visible security was somewhere in the crowd already. He came through the main atrium entrance and walked directly toward the corridor. He did not scan the room. He knew where she was. He had known before he came through the door. What happened in the seconds after his arrival was not something anyone planned. It was the accumulated understanding of every person in that corridor who knew either from direct knowledge or from the specific atmosphere that surrounds a man like Roman Davel that the dynamic had just shifted beyond the point of ordinary consequence. Security personnel across the floor found reasons to stand straighter. 2 store managers appeared in their doorways. The ambient noise of the corridor dropped by half before Roman had taken 10 steps. Derek Halston, who was still standing near the atrium with his girlfriend and his associates, noticed this change in the room before he identified its cause. He saw people moving differently. He saw expressions changing. He turned to look at what they were looking at. He saw a man in a dark coat walking with the particular purpose of someone who already knows the outcome of where they're going. He didn't know who it was. Not yet. Roman crossed the corridor and stopped in front of Zariah. For a moment, just a moment, something moved through his face that was not anger. Exactly. It was something more fundamental than anger. The expression of a man who has lived his entire adult life in a world where most things can be solved or controlled, and who has discovered, sometime in the last 3 years, that there are exactly 2 things that undo him completely. His wife, his daughter. "Did he hurt you?" he said. Not a question. A confirmation request. He was already scanning her, the way she'd watched him do 100 times, checking her posture, her hands, her face. "No," she said. His eyes moved to the gift in her hands. The damaged ribbon, the crushed corner. Then he looked at Nyla. Nyla looked back at him with her quiet, watchful eyes and held up the gift so he could see. Roman Davel, a man who had sat across negotiating tables from people who were afraid of him, who had walked into rooms where his presence alone determined what happened next, who had built 11 years of controlled, calculated power in a city that rewarded ruthlessness, looked at that small damaged box in his daughter's hands, and something happened to his face that very few people had ever been permitted to see. His jaw tightened. He looked back across the corridor. Derek Halston had recognized him. You could tell. It moved through Derek the way cold water does, sudden and total. His posture changed. The color of his face changed. He took one involuntary half-step backward before he caught himself, and that half-step was the most honest thing he'd done all afternoon. Roman didn't move toward him immediately. He turned back to Zariah first. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm sure." He looked at her for a moment longer, the particular look of a man checking whether the person he loves is telling him the full truth, as opposed to the manageable version of it. Zariah had been managing things on her own for so long that she sometimes edited things down without meaning to. He knew that about her. She knew he knew it. "The box might be broken," she said. "We haven't opened it. We'll find another one. Nyla wants that one. Then we'll find that one." He said it the way he said most things, not as a reassurance, but as a statement of what was going to happen. He was already turning back toward the corridor. Derek had not left, which was either confidence or paralysis, hard to tell which. Roman walked toward him. His girlfriend had taken 2 steps back. His associates were very carefully examining other directions. Derek himself had straightened, gone back to a performance of confidence that his eyes weren't quite executing, and as Roman stopped in front of him, he said, with a voice that only had a slight waver in it, "Look, I don't know who you are, but because the woman you've been humiliating," Roman said, "is my wife." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the ambient music from the store 30 feet away. Some soft jazz thing that had no business being in this particular moment. Derek's mouth was open. Roman looked at him with the patient expression of someone who has made a decision and doesn't need the other person's reaction to confirm it. "My daughter's birthday present," Roman said, "is in my wife's hands. And my wife's hand was touched after she asked you not to touch her." Derek said, "I didn't. I wasn't trying to. I know what you were trying to do." Roman's voice was level, quiet, quieter than the surrounding silence, somehow. I'm not interested in what you were trying to do. I'm interested in what you did. He turned slightly and made a small gesture. A man in a dark jacket, one of the security personnel who had been present the whole time, invisible until now, moved to the corridor's surveillance panel near the service corridor entrance. We're going to pull the footage, Roman said. We're going to collect tapes from the people in this corridor who watched what happened. All of it, documented. Then I'll decide what to do with it. Derek's confidence had been entirely replaced by something else now. Something calculating and desperate. The expression of a man running numbers in his head that weren't adding up. That's not you can't just. You grabbed my wife's hand, Roman said. After she told you not to touch her. You destroyed property in front of my daughter? He paused. You can finish that sentence if you'd like. But think carefully about what comes after, can't. Derek didn't finish the sentence. Roman looked at him for another 3 seconds. The particular 3 seconds of a man making sure the other man understands the scope of what has just occurred, and then he turned away. Not because the conversation was over, but because he had more important things to do than watch Derek Halston understand his situation. He walked back to Zariah. He put his hand on her shoulder, not possessively, not protectively, just there. The way people touch each other when they've been worried and the worry is just beginning to settle. Come on, he said. He put his other hand on top of Nyla's head, and Nyla, in the way of children who have learned which adults are safe, leaned into his side. They walked toward the elevator together. Zariah did not look back. She didn't need to. She already knew the look that had been on Derek Halston's face in the final second before she turned away. She had seen that look before, not on Derek, but on others. On people who had said that's not possible, and then discovered, with horrible slowness, that it was. She didn't feel satisfaction about it. Not yet, and maybe not ever, in the way she once thought she might, back in the years when she used to imagine moments like this and picture herself feeling triumphant. Mostly what she felt, walking toward the elevator with her husband's hand on her shoulder and her daughter's hand in hers, was tired and relieved, and something complicated, that she didn't have a clean word for the feeling of having been seen by the right person at the wrong time, and of having stood through it anyway, and of having not broken. Nyla looked up at her in the elevator. Is the music box going to be okay? Zariah looked at the box in her hands, the damaged ribbon, the bent corner. We're going to find out, she said. The elevator doors closed. The elevator opened on the parking level, and the three of them walked out into the gray concrete quiet of the structure. And for a moment, the only sound was their footsteps and the distant mechanical hum of ventilation somewhere above them. And Nyla was still holding the damaged gift box with both hands the way she'd been holding it, since Roman came back to her in the corridor carefully, like something injured that might still be saved. Roman's car was already waiting. It was always already waiting. That was one of the things Zariah had taken the longest to get used to, the way logistics simply arranged themselves around him, invisibly, without discussion. Cars appeared. Doors were held. Routes was cleared. She had spent enough years arranging everything herself, from bus schedules to grocery runs to her sister's medication pickups, that the absence of that effort still felt slightly wrong sometimes, like a phantom limb in reverse. She got in. Nyla slid in beside her. Roman got in last, and the door closed, and the driver pulled out without being told where to go because he already knew. Nyla set the gift box on her lap and looked at it. Can we open it now? She asked. Wait until we get home, Zariah said. What if it's broken? Then we'll know when we get home. Nyla looked at the box, then at Roman. What if the horses are broken? Roman looked at her. He had a way of giving Nyla his full attention that Zariah had noticed early in their relationship, not the distracted half-attention that adults usually gave children, where they were physically present but mentally somewhere else. When Roman looked at Nyla, he actually looked at her. If the horses are broken, he said, we get new horses, but it has to be that one. Amara's birthday is in 6 days. I know. The lady wrapped it already. I know that too. Nyla studied him with the particular skepticism of a child who has learned that adults say things will be fine, and then sometimes things are not fine. How are you going to fix it? I'll find a way. That's not an answer. Roman said no, it's not. He looked out the window for a moment, then back at her. But it's what I've got right now. Sometimes that's how it works. Nyla appeared to consider this. Then she nodded, slowly. The way she nodded, when she decided to accept something, even though she wasn't entirely satisfied with it. She pressed the corner of the gift box gently, trying to push it back into shape. Zariah watched her daughter's hands on the box and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not sadness, exactly. Not anger, exactly. Something in between those things. The specific weight of watching your child absorb something that happened to them and adapt to it and continue forward, because adaptation and continuation were things Nyla had been doing since before Zariah ever knew her. She turned and looked out her own window. Roman's hand found hers on the seat between them. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand over hers and kept it there, and she let him, and they rode the rest of the way home without talking. The apartment was warm. It was always warm. Zariah had a thing about heating, about coming in from cold air, and having the space immediately envelop you, and Roman had never once commented on the thermostat being set the way she liked it, even though she suspected he ran warmer than she did. Small things. The accumulation of small things was what a marriage actually was. She had come to understand, not the grand moments. The small concessions made without complaint, over and over, until they became invisible. Nyla took the gift box to the kitchen table and set it down and looked at Zariah. Now? Now. She unwrapped it carefully, not the tearing rip that most children deployed on packages, but the slow, deliberate unwrapping of a child who had learned not to waste things, who had learned to handle things carefully, because things did not always come again. She folded the torn ribbon to one side. She eased the tape off the paper, without ripping it more than it already was. The box underneath was intact. She opened the box. The carousel sat inside in its molded foam holder, the horses in their gold and blue paint exactly as they'd appeared in the store. Nyla lifted it out, set it on the table, found the winding mechanism on the base, and turned it carefully. The melody began. 3 notes, repeating. Thin and clear and slightly mechanical, in the way music box melodies always are not quite music, but not quite not music either. The horses began to turn. Nyla watched them turn. Then she looked up at Zariah and said, "It works." Zariah said, "It works." Nyla nodded. She reached out and wound the mechanism one more time, and they both watched the horses go around, and the melody played, and it was fine. Everything was fine, except that Zariah's hands were shaking slightly, and she had only just noticed. She noticed because she was washing them at the kitchen sink while Roman stood behind her in the doorway, and she looked down and saw the tremor in her fingers under the water. And she turned the tap off and gripped the edge of the sink and breathed. Roman said, from the doorway, "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." "That's not what I said." She turned around. He was leaning in the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with the expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was concerned, and was managing the concern carefully, because he knew that if he expressed it the wrong way, she would redirect her energy into reassuring him, and stop processing what had actually happened to her. He had learned that about her. She sometimes forgot how much he'd learned. "I'm okay," she said. "I know you are. Then why are you looking at me like that?" Because being okay and needing 5 minutes to actually feel what happened are 2 different things, and you keep treating them like they're the same thing. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was quiet. Nyla was in her room with the carousel, and the thin melody drifted down the hallway every time she wound it up again, and Zariah thought about that sound, and about the mall corridor, and about the exact moment when Derek's hand opened and the gift fell. "He dropped it on purpose," she said. "I know." He looked right at her when he did it. He looked at Nyla, and he just opened his hand. Roman said nothing. "She didn't cry," Zariah said. "Did you notice that?" "She didn't cry. She just stood there and looked at it on the floor." "I noticed. She never cries. Not when things like that happen." She paused. "She cries about other things. When she's tired, or when I raise my voice too much about something small. But when something actually happens to her, she just goes quiet and adjusts." Zariah shook her head slightly. "That's not normal. That's a learned behavior. Kids her age should cry when things are taken from them." Roman said quietly, "She's learning new things. She shouldn't have to." Zariah's voice had gone flat, the particular flatness that preceded something cracking. She shouldn't be in a situation where someone humiliates her mother in front of her and drops her birthday present on the floor. and she already knows instinctively to go quiet and hold on. No, Roman said, she shouldn't. I should have walked away the second I saw him. Maybe. I knew what he was going to do. Not specifically, but I knew. I know how he operates. I stood there anyway because I didn't want to look like I was running from him. That's human. It was stupid. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He came off the doorframe and walked to the sink and leaned against the counter beside her, not touching her. Just present, the way he was often present, not invasive, not distant, just there. You didn't do anything wrong. You responded to a man who decided to use a child's birthday present as a prop in his own performance. That's on him. All of it. I know. You know it up here, he said, and touched 2 fingers briefly to the side of his own head. Up here is fine. I'm asking about the rest of it. Zariah looked at the counter, at her own hands on the edge of the sink. The tremor was gone now. She was steadier than she'd been 5 minutes ago. That was always how it worked with her. The shaking came after, when the immediate thing was over, when her body finally had permission to react. I'm angry, she said. That's mostly what I am. I'm angry that I had to stand in the middle of that mall and be looked at like that. Like I was still the same person he decided to leave. Like nothing I've done since then counted. Like my whole life was just, she stopped. And the ring. He saw the ring and he laughed. He actually laughed. Roman was quiet for a moment. He won't be laughing for long, he said. Something in his voice made her look at him. His expression was calm. It was the particular calm she had come to recognize as the surface of something much colder underneath. She had seen that calm before, in different contexts, and she had learned not to mistake stillness for inaction. Roman. I'm not going to do anything to him, Zariah. That's not how that sounded. I mean it. I'm not going to touch him. He held her gaze. I don't have to. She studied his face. She had become good at reading him over the years, not fluent. Exactly. Because he was not a man who was easy to read, but good enough to identify the difference between the things he said because he wanted her reassured and the things he said because they were simply true. What does that mean? She asked. It means that when my people pulled the surveillance record, they also ran a standard background on the man, because that's what they do when someone puts their hands on you. He said it matter-of-factly, with no particular emphasis. Derek Halston has a development project, a waterfront property near the lower harbor. He's been trying to secure financing for about 8 months. Zariah went still. One of the investment groups reviewing the deal, Roman said, is mine. The kitchen was very quiet. I didn't know that when we were standing in the mall, he said. I found out about 20 minutes ago. Roman, I haven't decided anything. I'm telling you what I found out. He looked at her steadily. But there are some irregularities in the financial documentation that my people flagged when they ran the background. Things that a thorough examination would likely surface. Zariah looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me that Derek Halston may have already dug his own grave, she said slowly, and today he just handed you the map. Roman said nothing, which was itself an answer. She turned back to the sink. She ran the water again cold this time, and washed her hands again, which didn't need washing, and thought about Derek Halston's face when he'd seen Roman walk through those doors, the color leaving it, the half-step backward. She thought about what it had cost her to stand in that corridor. She thought about Nyla's hands on the damaged gift box. Don't do anything because of me, she said. I won't. I mean it. So do I. He pushed off the counter and moved toward the hallway. But if his own records show what my people think they show, that's not about you. That's about him. And what he's done has nothing to do with what happened this afternoon. He paused. Sometimes things just come due. He left the kitchen. Down the hall, the carousel melody started again. Derek Halston's apartment was on the 44th floor of a building on the Upper East Side, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked south over the city. And standing at those windows in the dark with a glass of scotch that had been full 20 minutes ago and was now almost empty, he was thinking about the expression on Roman Davel's face in the mall corridor. He'd known who Roman was. Of course he had. Everyone in a certain tier of New York business knew who Roman Davel was, in the way that you knew certain things about a city, which buildings were load-bearing, which streets flooded in heavy rain, which names you didn't say carelessly. You knew them not because you'd been told exactly, but because the knowledge was ambient in the walls. He had not known that Roman Davel was married to Zariah Monroe. That was the part he kept coming back to. not the threat implicit in Roman's presence, or the surveillance footage his people had apparently secured, or the audience of strangers who had watched the whole thing with their phones. Half-raised. He kept coming back to the specific fact that Zariah Monroe, a woman he had left, because she was too heavy and too broke and too complicated and not impressive enough for the version of himself he was constructing had. Apparently married one of the most feared men in New York. He poured more scotch. It didn't make sense. He had a model of how the world worked, a model he'd refined over 15 years of watching who succeeded and who didn't, and in that model, there was a particular category for women like Zariah, the ones who were too much of some things and not enough of others, who would always be struggling against the wrong kind of gravity. He had assigned her to that category. He had been certain about it. He was less certain now. His girlfriend, Camille, came out of the bedroom in one of his shirts, carrying her own glass of wine, and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at his back. "Are you going to tell me what that was?" she said. "Nothing, Derek. Old girlfriend. It's nothing." Camille came into the living room. She had known Derek for 7 months, long enough to distinguish between his performative confidence and his real one. What she'd seen in the mall corridor was a gap between those two things wide enough to drive through. "Who is he?" she asked. Derek didn't answer. "The man who came in." She sat down on the arm of the couch. The whole corridor changed when he walked in. Security people were, I don't know how to describe it. They just stood differently. He's nobody. That is the opposite of what that looked like. "Camille, I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw." She looked at him steadily. She was not a woman who was easily managed, which was one of the reasons he'd chosen her, and one of the reasons she sometimes exhausted him. His name, a long pause. "Roman Davell," Derek said. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Camille set her wine glass down on the coffee table carefully, with the deliberate care of someone making sure they were handling things correctly. She looked at the glass. Then she looked at Derek. "You dropped that woman's child's birthday present on the floor," she said. "I didn't, it slipped. I was standing right there, Derek. I saw your hand open." He said nothing. "And the woman is married to Roman Davell." She paused. "And you grabbed her hand after she told you not to touch her. In front of cameras. You're making it sound like..." "I'm describing what happened." Her voice was level, which was more unsettling than if she'd been angry. "I'm describing exactly what happened, and I need you to hear how it sounds when someone describes it out loud." Derek turned from the window. His face in the ambient light of the apartment was doing several things: simultaneously defensiveness and calculation, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine concern. "He's not going to do anything. Men like that don't." "Men like what?" Camille asked. "What do you actually know about men like that?" "Because I grew up in a neighborhood where I knew men like that, and what you think you know about what they do and don't do is probably very wrong." Derek's jaw tightened. He said he was pulling surveillance footage. "I know. I heard him." "For what? To show that I what? Dropped something? Had an argument with an ex-girlfriend in a mall?" "That's not. He didn't say it was for the footage." Camille picked her wine glass back up. He said he was documenting it. "That's different." She stood. "I'm going to bed." "But Derek, whatever this project you're pushing through right now, the waterfront thing." She stopped. "What about it?" She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Make sure your paperwork is clean," she said. She went back to the bedroom. Derek stood at the window for another hour. The scotch was gone. The city was bright below him, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere in it, he knew, things were already moving that he hadn't started and couldn't stop. He'd looked at Zariah Monroe in that mall and seen the same woman he'd left, the same weight, the same simplicity, the same quiet dignity that he'd always read as limitation. He'd seen her wedding ring and felt something he wanted to call amusement, but was probably closer to disbelief. And he'd acted from that disbelief, the way he always acted from his certainties decisively, without hesitation, completely sure of himself. He was not sure of himself now. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. The attorney's name was Marcus Webb, and he answered on the 4th ring, with the voice of a man who had been woken up and was deciding how he felt about it. "Derek, I need you to look at something." "It's late." "I know. Tomorrow morning, first thing." "The Meridian Harbor file." A pause. "What specifically?" "The financing documentation. The projections from the August review. The gap between the Phase 2 estimates and the actual disbursements." Another pause. Longer this time. Derek, Marcus said. Carefully. Just look at it. I've looked at it. We've both looked at it. We made decisions based on, I need to know if there's anything that could be framed as irregularity by someone looking for it. The pause that followed this was the kind that had weight. The kind that meant the person on the other end was deciding how honest to be. There are certain elements, Marcus said finally, that are open to interpretation. Derek closed his eyes. How open, he said. Depending on who's doing the interpreting and what they're looking for. Marcus stopped. Why? What happened? Derek said, I think someone may be looking. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then who? Derek didn't answer that directly. Can we clean it up? Not retroactively. Not in a way that doesn't know. Not cleanly. There are timestamps. There are corresponding records from the partner banks. Marcus's voice had changed register. Derek, what did you do? Nothing I wouldn't have done if I'd known. He stopped. Tried again. I need to know our exposure. Our exposure, Marcus said slowly, depends on who's looking and with what kind of access. Routine review manageable. Targeted examination by someone with the right connections and the right motivation. He paused. You need to tell me who this is. Derek looked out the window at the city below. I'll call you in the morning, he said. He hung up. He stood there in the dark for another long moment, and then something occurred to him that he hadn't let himself fully consider yet. A thing that had been standing in the peripheral vision of his thoughts all evening, and that he'd been carefully not looking at directly. Roman Davel hadn't threatened him. In the corridor, with the entire mall watching and the footage being pulled, and every reason in the world to say exactly what he could and would do, Roman Davel had said almost none of it. He'd stated facts. He'd described what had happened. He'd used the word documented, and then he'd turned away. Men who made threats needed the threat to be the act. The threat was the power, and they needed you to feel it immediately. Men who didn't need to make threats were the ones who already knew the outcome. Derek set his empty glass down on the window ledge. His phone lit up. Text message, unknown number. 4 words. We should talk. Soon, he stared at the screen. The number had no contact name, no area code he recognized. He had not given this number to anyone new recently. He had not. He stared at the message. He had no idea who this was. He typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds. Someone who was also at the mall today. Someone who's been watching the Meridian Harbor project for other reasons. You're going to want to hear what I know, before Davel's people finish what they've started. Derek's hand tightened on the phone. He stood in the dark of his 44th floor apartment, the city blazing below him, the scotch gone, and the certainty he'd walked into that mall, with as thoroughly destroyed as a gift box on a marble floor, and he looked at the message on his screen and understood, with the crawling clarity of a man who has spent his whole life being sure of himself, and has just discovered that certainty can be revoked without warning, that he was no longer in control of what happened next. He typed when. The response tomorrow. Don't tell your lawyer first. He set the phone face down on the window ledge. Outside, New York kept moving, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had, the way it had moved when he was nobody, and when he became somebody, and on every day in between, the city making no distinction between the people who thought they understood how it worked and the people who actually did. In a different apartment, on a different floor of a different building across the park, a carousel played its 3-note melody one more time and then wound down into silence. Derek didn't sleep. Camille had taken her half and turned away from him and gone quiet in the particular of someone who is not actually sleeping, but has decided that sleep is preferable to conversation, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about the text message and about Roman Davel's face and about Marcus's voice on the phone when he'd said there are certain elements that are open to interpretation. At 4 in the morning, he got up and went to his home office and opened the Meridian Harbor file on his laptop. He knew what was in it. He had always known what was in it. But there is a difference between knowing something in the comfortable abstraction of a plan that is working and knowing it in the specific, sleepless clarity of 3:58 in the morning when someone you cannot identify has just told you that the people examining it are already looking. He read through the August projections, the Phase 2 disbursement records, the gap between what the documentation showed and what had actually moved between accounts. This is the series of decisions, each one individually defensible. each one a small adjustment, each one reasonable in isolation, that had accumulated into something that looked, when you laid it all out in sequence, very much like a pattern. Marcus had helped him build that pattern. That was important to remember. Marcus had been there for every adjustment, every moved number, every reframed projection. Whatever exposure existed, it was shared. He typed a text to the unknown number. I need more than 4 words. Who are you and what do you know specifically? He waited. The response came at 5:12. My name is Vincent Caro. I was the Phase 1 financial auditor on Meridian Harbor before Halston Development replaced me in March. I know what the original numbers were. I kept copies. Derek read the message 3 times. Vincent Caro. He remembered the name. A small, precise man who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses to every mindset and asked questions that were always slightly more specific than Derek was comfortable with. He'd been replaced. Derek had told himself it was a restructuring, told Marcus it was a personnel decision, told the board it was a budget efficiency measure. The real reason was that Caro had flagged the Phase 1 projections as inconsistent with the land acquisition costs and had sent a memo internally suggesting a review. Derek had shut the review down. He had replaced Caro with an auditor who asked fewer questions. He had not apparently destroyed Caro's copies. He typed, "What do you want?" Caro's response, "Nothing you can give me at this point. I'm telling you because I think you should know that Davel's people contacted me yesterday evening. I don't know how they found me, but they did, and they asked the right questions, and I answered them. This message is professional courtesy. I thought you should know the timeline." Derek set the phone on his desk. He sat in his office chair and looked at the wall. Professional courtesy. The phrase had the specific cruelty of precision. It was accurate, it was complete, and it was delivered without malice, which made it worse than if Caro had been angry. Anger could be argued with. This was just information, delivered cleanly, without emotion. He thought about calling Marcus again. He thought about calling his board liaison, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been his ally on the Meridian Harbor approval process and who had certain reasons of his own to want the project to succeed without excessive scrutiny. He thought about calling the investment group contact, who had been managing the Davel portfolio review, a man he'd had dinner with twice, who had seemed friendly, who had seemed like someone Derek understood. He thought about all of these calls, and then he sat in his chair and did not make any of them. Because Caro had said they asked the right questions. Not general questions, not preliminary questions, the right ones. Which meant that whoever Roman Davel had sent to find Vincent Caro already knew enough to know what to ask. Which meant the examination wasn't beginning. The examination was already substantially complete. He had spent 36 hours telling himself that Roman Davel's presence in the mall was about Zariah, was about ego and territory and the possessiveness of powerful men. He had spent 36 hours constructing a version of events in which he was the victim of an overreaction, in which his exposure was manageable, in which the unknown number would turn out to be something he could navigate or neutralize. In the 512 light of his home office, with Vincent Caro's message on his phone and the Meridian Harbor file open on his screen, Derek Halston finally stopped constructing that version and looked at the one that was actually true. He had made serious mistakes. They were documented. Someone who both had the motivation to look and the resources to do it thoroughly had been looking since yesterday afternoon. And the man at the center of that someone's resources had watched Derek humiliate his wife and destroy his daughter's birthday present in a public corridor, and had said, quietly, without raising his voice once, "Sometimes things just come due." Derek closed the laptop. He put his hands flat on the desk and breathed. Rome was in his office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown by 7:30 in the morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that 3 people were already there. When he arrived, his head of financial intelligence, a woman named Petra Voss, who had worked for Roman for 8 years, and who spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who had learned that the difference between enough information and too much information could be career-defining. A man named Sal Moretti, who handled the legitimate investment portfolio and who looked like someone's accountant uncle, and was, in fact, someone's accountant uncle, which was precisely why Roman trusted him. And a third man, whom Zariah had never met and whose name she would never know, who sat slightly apart from the other 2 and said almost nothing. Roman sat down. He poured his own coffee. He looked at Petra. Tell me, said. Petra had a folder. She opened it. She did not refer to it. Particularly, it was more that she touched it periodically. The way people touch things they want to confirm are still there. Vincent Caro made copies of the original Phase 1 audit documents when he was removed from the project in March. He stored them with a personal attorney and also on an encrypted drive at his home. He was approached yesterday evening by Sal's contact at the firm reviewing Meridian Harbor. He cooperated without much hesitation. He'd been sitting on it for 6 months. He wanted to talk to someone who was actually to do something with it. Roman drank his coffee. What do the documents show? Sal leaned forward. He had the manner of a man who genuinely loved numbers, which was sometimes the most useful thing a person could love. The Phase 1 projections submitted to the investment review significantly overstated the projected rental income from the commercial units, not by a small amount. The overstatement brought the projected return above the threshold required for the institutional investors to commit. Below that threshold, the deal doesn't get funded. So the deal was structured around false projections. The deal could not have been structured around the real projections. The real projections don't support the capital requirements. Sal paused. There's more. The land acquisition cost in the submitted documentation is listed at $42 million. The actual acquisition, which we confirmed through county records, was $31 million. The $11 million difference, where is it? We're still tracing it. But it moved through 2 holding companies, both registered in Delaware, both with a single listed officer. Sal opened his own folder, Gerald Fitch, who is on the Meridian Harbor Approval Board. The room was quiet. Roman set his coffee down. So it's not just inflated projections, he said. No, Petra said. Land acquisition discrepancy looks like it may constitute direct fraud. Money was taken from the project capitalization and redirected before the project was even formally approved. The approval board member who was redirecting money was also voting on whether the project should proceed. Roman said nothing for a moment. He looked at the third man, the quiet one, who met his eyes briefly and then looked back at the table. The investment group's position, Roman said to Sal. We have not committed. We're in review. The documentation Caro provided changes the review substantially. Sal paused. If we formally withdraw and cite the discrepancies, we are legally obligated to report the specific grounds to the regulatory body overseeing the investment review, which triggers a formal examination. Roman said, then we withdraw. Sal nodded. He made a note. Petra, Roman said. The surveillance from the mall, documented, time-stamped. 4 independent witness statements, each taken separately, each consistent with the footage. His hand on the gift box, the drop, his hand on Mrs. Davel's hand after she'd asked him not to touch her. All of it. Hold it. Petra looked at him. Don't release it anywhere. Don't send it to anyone. Hold it. He picked up his coffee again. If he needs to understand what we have, we'll show him. We won't need to use it publicly. You're not going to. Petra stopped herself. In 8 years, she had learned certain thresholds. Understood, she said. Roman said, that's all for now. The third man left first. Then Sal. Petra paused at the door. Mrs. Davel, she said. Not a question, exactly. She's fine, Roman said. I know she is. Petra looked at him for a moment. I'm glad he said it in a public corridor, in front of cameras. She said it the way you'd say something factual about whether not emotional, just true. Then she left. Roman sat in the empty office and looked at the Manhattan skyline through the window and thought about Zariah's hands on the kitchen sink the evening before. The tremor she probably didn't know he'd seen. The way she'd said she shouldn't have to about Nyla's quiet adaptation to bad things, and the particular thickness in her voice when she said it, and the way she'd controlled that thickness with the discipline of a woman who had been controlling things like that for so long. It was almost automatic. He thought about the first time he'd seen her, not in the formal way people tell stories, and then I knew but the actual first time, which was confused and cold, and nothing like the version of it he might tell someone if asked. A rainstorm, a stopped car, a woman he'd registered initially as an obstacle, and then, in the next 30 seconds, as something else entirely, because she'd taken off her coat in a freezing January rain and put it around a stranger who was bleeding on the side of the road, and then she'd looked up, and her eyes had gone right through him in a way that had nothing to do with knowing who he was. She hadn't known who he was. That was the thing. In 11 years of his adult life, virtually no one he encountered did not know who he was, or didn't know enough to be careful. Zariah Monroe had looked at him on the side of a rain-soaked road, like he was a person, specifically a person, who was standing in the rain doing nothing useful, and had said, with the direct impatience of someone who had no time for anything but the immediate problem, "Are you going to help, or just stand there?" He had helped. He thought about that now, in his office, with the Manhattan skyline in the window and the Meridian Harbor file on his desk. He thought about the specific thing Derek Halston had decided when he looked at Zariah Monroe, the category he'd assigned her to, the ceiling he'd decided she had, the certainty with which he'd determined her worth and found it insufficient, and he thought about how wrong a person could be when they were absolutely certain. He picked up his phone and called Zariah. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, how'd she sleep?" "She slept fine. She wound the carousel about 6 more times before bed. I think the song is in my head permanently now." "Good." A pause. "You're already at the office." "Yes, Roman. I'm not doing anything you asked me not to do." Another pause. He could hear her reading the distinction in that sentence. Not, "I'm not doing anything," but "I'm not doing anything you asked me not to do." She was good at reading him. Sometimes he forgot how good. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Withdrawing from a bad investment," he said, "for documented reasons that have nothing to do with who the developer insulted yesterday." Silence on the line. "Is that true?" she asked. "The nothing to do with part." He thought about it. He gave her the honesty she'd always expected from him, which was the honesty that admitted the complications. "The reasons are real," he said. "The timing is what it is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to tell me what you found?" "When I get home." "Okay." She paused. "Roman, I know. I need to say it anyway. Say it. Don't make this about punishing him for what he said to me. I can live with what he said to me. I've lived with worse." Her voice was steady, not pretending to be unaffected, genuinely past the immediate wound in the way she moved past things, through them by refusing to let them become the center of gravity. "If there are real reasons to do what you're doing, do it because they're real, not because of me." "They're real," he said. "Then that's different," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Derek's phone rang at 9:47 in the morning. The number was Marcus Webb's office line, he answered. Marcus's voice was wrong. Not panicked. Marcus Webb did not panic. It was professionally inadvisable but compressed, tightened. The voice of a man who has received information and is currently managing the process of deciding what it means for him personally. "We have a problem," Marcus said. "I know. I don't think you know the specific problem I'm describing." Derek was sitting in his kitchen. He had not gone back to bed. He had made coffee and not drunk much of it, and he was still in the clothes he'd slept in, which he had not clothes he'd slept in, because he had not slept. "Tell me. Gerald Fitch called me this morning. Early. He's been contacted by a regulatory examiner. Preliminary inquiry. Meridian Harbor." Derek's stomach dropped. "They're not calling it an investigation yet," Marcus said. "Preliminary inquiry means they've received information suggesting a review is warranted. They haven't determined scope. But Gerald," a pause. "Gerald is not a man who handles pressure particularly well, Derek. You know this. What did he say to the examiner?" "He hasn't said anything yet. He's coming in this morning. He wanted to talk to me first." Another pause. "He's scared. And when Gerald Fitch is scared, he talks. It's what he does. It's what he's always done. I've watched him do it in 4 different situations over 12 years, and I've always been on the side of the table where his talking was useful to me. So I did not think about what it would look like if I was ever on the other side." Derek said, "What are you telling me, Marcus?" "I'm telling you that Gerald Fitch is going to cooperate with the preliminary inquiry. I believe he'll do it this morning, before close of business today, because that's how frightened men operate. They make the decision fast, before they can talk themselves out of it." Marcus's voice was very careful now. "And if Gerald cooperates with the preliminary inquiry, the land acquisition discrepancy becomes part of the record, which changes the nature of the inquiry." Derek stood up from the kitchen stool. He walked to the window. The city was below him, moving. How much does Gerald know? He knows his part. The holding companies, the acquisition cost differential, his signature on the approval vote. He doesn't know the full documentation structure. A pause. "But Derek, his part is enough." Derek gripped the windowsill. "Is there anything we can do?" he said. between now and when he talks. The silence that followed told him everything. Before Marcus said a word. No, Mark said. I don't believe there is. I'm calling you because I'm your attorney, and I am obligated to inform you. I am also calling you because I need you to understand that when Gerald talks to the examiner, my name is in the documentation, too. And I want you to know that I will be protecting my own interests in this process, fully, whatever that requires. Derek understood what that meant. Marcus Webb had just told him, in the language of attorneys, that he was not going to go down with the ship, that if cooperation served Marcus's interests, Marcus would cooperate, that the alliance between them, which had been built on mutual benefit and mutual exposure, had just recalibrated in the direction of Marcus's survival. Right, Derek said. I'm sorry, Marcus said. And then, with the particular honesty of a man who has decided to cut a loss, I'm genuinely sorry. I think we made decisions together that seemed reasonable at the time, and that looked different in a different light. I think we both convinced ourselves it was fine. I think we were wrong. A pause. That doesn't change what I have to do now. Derek said nothing. Get your own attorney, Marcus said. Not me. Someone who hasn't been inside the process. Do it today. The line went dead. Derek stood at the window for a long time. Camille came out of the bedroom. She was dressed, fully dressed. Not a shirt and jeans, but actually dressed, which meant she had gotten up and showered and made a decision about her day before coming to find him. She had a bag over her shoulder. She looked at him. Are you going to tell me what's actually happening? She said. He turned from the window. He looked at her, at the bag, at her posture, the specific expression on her face that told him she had already begun calculating how close to this she was willing to stand. There's a regulatory inquiry, he said. Meridian Harbor. It's preliminary, but he stopped. It may get worse. Camille said, how much worse? I don't know yet. She looked at him steadily. Derek, how much of what's in that project is what you told the investors it was? He said nothing. How much? She said again. The silence in the apartment was absolute. Camille nodded, once the small decisive nod of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed and is already moving to the next calculation. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. I have a lunch, she said. I'm going to be out most of the day. Camille, I'll call you tonight, she said. We'll talk then. She left. Derek stood in the living room of his 44th floor apartment and listened to the elevator arrive and depart, and then the building was quiet. The way expensive buildings were quiet, completely, expensively, without any acknowledgement that the person inside was falling apart. His phone rang again at 11:15. Unknown number. Different from the one Vincent Caro had used. He stared at it for 3 rings before he answered. Mr. Halston. The voice was female, professional. The practiced neutral of someone whose job required them to deliver information without inflection. My name is Dana Reeves. I'm with Castellan Regulatory Partners. We've been engaged to facilitate the preliminary inquiry into the Meridian Harbor Development Project. I'd like to schedule a time for you to come in voluntarily and speak with our team. Derek sat down. Voluntarily, he said. At this stage, yes. Voluntary cooperation reflects well on a subject's. I understand what voluntary means. He said it more sharply than he intended. He breathed, when? We have availability Thursday afternoon. 2 o'clock. Thursday. 2 days. He would need an attorney by Thursday morning. He would need to decide by Thursday morning how he was approaching this, whether he was cooperating, whether he was contesting, whether there was still some version of this where the thing could be minimized. He would need to know what Gerald Fitch had already said. He would need to know if Marcus had already made his own preliminary contact. He would need in 2 days to understand the full shape of the catastrophe and decide who he was willing to be inside of it. Thursday, he said. 2 o'clock. We'll send confirmation to your registered business address. Fine. He hung up. He sat in his apartment, which was very large and very quiet and very expensive, and he thought about what it had cost him. Not in the financial sense, though. That calculation was coming, was already beginning its approach on the horizon. In the other sense, the one that was harder to account for. He had spent 15 years building himself into a version of himself that was worth something. That was the project. Underneath all the other projects, the apartment and the company and the social position and the women who looked right beside him and the friends who were useful and the enemies he could afford to dismiss. The project of becoming someone whose value was legible to the people he wanted to impress. He had stood in a Manhattan shopping mall and looked at a woman he'd discarded and felt the need to remind her of her position. To re-establish the hierarchy he'd built in his head, the one where she was below him and always would be. He had done it in front of cameras. He had done it in front of witnesses. He had done it in front of her child. And then he had walked out of that mall and gone home and poured scotch and convinced himself for approximately 14 hours that the man who'd walked in and said, "She is my wife," was a problem he could manage. He hadn't even asked himself, in those 14 hours, the most obvious question. He asked it now, sitting in the quiet apartment with the inquiry scheduled, and his attorney gone, and his girlfriend carrying her bag toward the elevator. He asked himself, what kind of man do you actually want to be? He did not have an answer. What he had, instead, was the specific knowledge that in 48 hours, he would sit across a table from a regulatory examiner, and that person would look at the documents and ask questions, and Derek Halston would have to decide in real time, under pressure, with consequences that were no longer abstract, whether he was going to be the kind of man who told the truth or the kind of man who. He was going to be the kind of man who told the truth. That was the decision. It arrived not with any drama or relief, but with the flat, exhausted clarity of a man who has run out of alternatives and discovered that at the bottom of all of them is the same thing, the thing he should have done first, before the projections were inflated and the land costs were redirected, and Gerald Fitch signed a vote he'd been financially incentivized to sign. Derek Halston sat in his apartment and made the decision and then sat with it for 20 minutes, because making a decision and knowing what to do with it are two separate things, and he still had 48 hours before Thursday, and he needed to use them correctly. He called a woman named Harriet Sloan, who was a criminal defense attorney, and whose name he knew because she had represented 3 people in his business circle over the years, and had, in 2 of those 3 cases, produced outcomes that were better than the evidence warranted. He had never expected to need her personally. He called her now. She answered her own phone, which he hadn't expected. He told her who he was. He told her, in approximately 4 minutes of uninterrupted speaking, what the situation was. He left almost nothing out. He included Marcus Webb's name and Gerald Fitch's name, and the holding companies and the land cost differential and Vincent Caro's copies and the Thursday 2 o'clock meeting. Harriet Sloan listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Don't talk to anyone else today. Not Marcus, not Fitch, not the examiner's office, not your board, not your girlfriend. Nobody. I already talked to Marcus. I know. I mean from now forward." A pause. "You said you want to cooperate." "Yes." "Full cooperation." "Yes." That means telling them things they don't already know. Not just confirming what they've got. Full cooperation means you are actively useful to their process, which means implicating everyone who was involved, completely, in exchange for a negotiated outcome for yourself. She said it the way doctors describe procedures clearly, without cushioning. "Are you prepared to do that with Marcus Webb and Gerald Fitch?" Derek looked at the wall. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. "Come in today, 3 o'clock. We're going to spend the rest of today and tomorrow building the most complete account of this that you are capable of producing. By Thursday morning, you will know exactly what you're walking into that room to say." A pause. "Mr. Halston, I need you to understand something before we go further." "What?" "Cooperation doesn't erase consequence. It shapes it. You will still face consequences. The question we're working on is what kind and how extensive." She paused again. "Do you understand the difference between those 2 things?" He did. He understood it the way you understand something you've been avoiding completely, immediately, once you stop looking away from it. "Yes," he said. 3 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late." She hung up. Derek stood. He went to the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror, the same face he'd looked at for 41 years, the same features he'd spent 15 years learning to present in the right light to the right people. And he looked at that face for a long moment without any particular conclusion, and then he turned the shower on and stood under it until the water went cold. Roman got home at 6. Nyla was at the kitchen table doing homework, which she did with the focused frown of someone for whom school was simultaneously important and personally offensive. She looked up when he came in, assessed him in the particular way. She'd developed a quick scan checking for the things children who have lived through uncertainty learn to check for, and apparently found nothing alarming, because she went back to her worksheet. We had pizza, she said. There's some left. Good. Mama said you'd probably be hungry. She was right. He set his coat down and went to find Zariah, who was in the study with her laptop, reading something that she closed when he came in. Not secretively, just the closure of someone who was switching contexts. Nyla has a fractions test Friday, she said. She knows the process, but she keeps making errors on the final step. I don't know if it's rushing or if the concept isn't fully. Zariah. She looked at him. He's cooperating with the regulatory inquiry, he said. Voluntarily. He retained a defense attorney today. Harriet Sloan. Zariah was quiet. I found out this afternoon, through a contact at the examiner's firm. He sat down in the chair across from her. He's not fighting it. He's going in Thursday to cooperate. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the desk. Then she said, does that change things? For what happens to him? It changes the shape of it. The outcome is still, he's going to lose the project. The financial misconduct is documented independently of anything I did or didn't do. Gerald Fitch will lose his position on the board. Marcus Webb is likely facing a separate bar inquiry. He paused. Halston himself, if the cooperation is as complete as Sloan typically produces, may avoid criminal charges. He'll lose the company in its current form. He'll lose his position in the investment community for a long time. Maybe permanently. Zariah absorbed this. He chose to cooperate, she said. Yes. On his own. Yes. Before we had any direct contact with him. Roman looked at her carefully. I want you to know that. She nodded slowly. She turned this over. He watched her doing it, the particular process, of someone who has spent years being precise about the difference between what they wanted to be true and what was actually true, and who applied that precision to good news as rigorously as to bad. Okay, she said finally. Okay? I believe you. She looked at him. And I don't know how I feel about the rest of it yet. I need to think about it. She paused. What about the footage? From the mall? Still held. I'm not releasing it. Will you need to? No. He said it with certainty. It's documented and preserved. If he or anyone connected to him tries to change the story of what happened, it's there. But I don't need to use it publicly. I'm not going to. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. They looked at each other across the study, and in the kitchen Nyla made the particular sound of a child who has just made a mistake on a worksheet and is expressing her feelings about it, and they both heard it, and the corner of Zariah's mouth moved slightly. Fractions, she said. I'll go, Roman said. He went to the kitchen and sat across from Nyla and looked at the worksheet and spent 22 minutes explaining the final step of the process in 4 different ways until the one that worked for Nyla's specific brain clicked into place, and he knew it clicked because her frown dissolved into the particular expression of someone who has just understood something and is almost annoyed by how simple it turned out to be. Oh, she said. That's it. That's so easy. It will be, he said, once you've done it 50 times. She looked at him. Why 50? That's usually how many times something takes before your hands know how to do it without your brain having to think about it. She considered this. How many times did it take you to learn things? Depends on the thing. What's the hardest thing you ever had to learn? He thought about it. He looked at this child, this small, serious, direct child who asked questions like they were simply the next logical step in a conversation, without any particular awareness that some questions were loaded, and he said, honestly, how to trust people. Nyla nodded, like this was a reasonable answer. Me too, she said. She picked up her pencil. Can we do the next one? They did the next 5 together. Thursday arrived, the way consequential days always do, with the same light as every other morning, the same coffee, the same ordinary texture of a day that has no idea it's being historic. Derek Halston put on a suit. A good one, but not his best one. Harriet Sloan had been specific about that. You're not going in to impress anyone. You're going in to be honest. Dress like a man who is taking responsibility, not like a man who is still trying to win. He looked at himself in the bedroom mirror. Camille had not come back the night before. She'd called, as she said she would, and they'd talked for 40 minutes of conversation that was more honest than most of their conversations had been, because she was asking the kind of questions that required real answers, and he was, for the first time in recent memory, providing them. She hadn't said she was leaving. She hadn't said she wasn't. She'd said she needed time to think, which was fair, and he'd told her that was fair, and she'd said, "I'll talk to you after Thursday," and he'd said, "Okay." He rode the elevator down alone. The regulatory firm's office was in a building on 6th Avenue, 12 floors up, with conference rooms that looked out over the street and had the particular neutral decor of spaces, specifically designed to be unmemorable. Harriet Sloane was already there. When he arrived, she was always already there. He'd come to understand in the last 48 hours. It was part of how she operated, and she was talking quietly to a young associate and didn't look up when Derek walked in, which was deliberate, which told him she was not performing anything for him. He sat down. "They're going to start with Fitch," she said without preamble. "They talked to him yesterday. What he gave them was substantial, but there are gaps, because Fitch only knew his portion. Your account fills the gaps." She looked at him. "When they ask you questions, answer them completely. Don't anticipate where they're going, and don't try to get ahead of it. Listen to each question and answer exactly that question. If you don't know something, say you don't know. If you're uncertain, say you're uncertain. I know you know. I'm saying it again because people forget in the room." She paused. "Ready?" Derek looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. His heart was doing something irregular, in his chest, not fast exactly, but present in a way hearts usually weren't. Each beat slightly more noticeable than it should be. "Yes," he said, "the examiners came in. It took 4 hours. Not because there was drama, there wasn't. It was relentlessly procedural. Questions asked, answers given. Documents produced, statements entered into record. The lead examiner was a man in his 50s named Curtis, who had the patience of someone who had done this many times, and who understood that the goal was accuracy, not speed. His associate was younger, and took notes with focused efficiency, and occasionally asked follow-up questions that were sharper than Curtis's, the sharpness of someone still learning to distinguish between the relevant and the irrelevant and erring on the side of including everything. Derek answered every question. He answered the questions about the Phase 1 projections and how they'd been adjusted and who had been in the room when the adjustments were made. He answered the questions about the land acquisition cost and where the $11 million differential had gone, and which holding companies had been used and who had set them up. He answered the questions about Gerald Fitch and what Fitch had known and when he'd known it. He answered the questions about Marcus Webb and the specific conversations they'd had about the documentation and the specific moments when each of them had made the decision to proceed rather than stop. He answered a question about Vincent Caro, why Caro had been replaced, who had made that decision, what the actual reason was. He answered it honestly. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, Curtis looked up from his notes and said, "Mr. Halston, I want to ask you something outside the formal record for a moment." Derek looked at Harriet. She gave a small nod. "Go ahead," Derek said. "What made you decide to cooperate voluntarily?" Curtis asked. "You had 48 hours. That's enough time to construct a defense, to coordinate with the other parties, to move things around. Why did you come in here and tell us everything?" Derek thought about how to answer this. He thought about the real answer versus the strategic answer, and he thought about Harriet Sloane sitting beside him and what she'd said about the difference between shaping consequence and erasing it. And he thought about Zariah Monroe standing in a mall corridor with her daughter's gift in her hands and her back straight, and her voice completely level, saying he saw what you never could. "Because I've spent 15 years being very certain about things," Derek said, "and I've been wrong about more of them than I knew." He paused. "I thought being certain was the same as being right. It isn't." Curtis looked at him for a moment. He nodded once. He made a note. "Back on the record," he said. The session ended at 4:17. Derek walked out with Harriet Sloane, and they stood on the sidewalk on 6th Avenue with the late afternoon traffic moving around them, and she looked at her notes and then at him. "That went as well as that kind of thing can go," she said, "which means it went badly in a way that will produce the least bad outcome for you. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes." "Go home. I'll call you tomorrow with the next steps." She paused. "Whatever's coming, and things are coming, you went in there, and you told the truth completely. That matters. Not in an abstract way. It matters specifically for what happens next." She looked at him with the professional assessment of someone who had sat in many rooms with many people and had learned to the ones who were genuinely turning a corner versus the ones who were performing the turn. "Don't undo it," she said. She got into a car. Derek stood on the sidewalk. The city moved around him the way it always had, enormous, indifferent, without any acknowledgement of the specific 4 hours he'd just spent, or the specific version of himself that had just walked out of that building. His phone vibrated. Text from a number he recognized, now the Davel Investment Group's liaison, a man named Prescott, who had been managing the Meridian Harbor Review. Formal withdrawal confirmed today. Ground submitted to regulatory body per legal obligation. No further action from our side. Derek read it twice. Then he typed back, understood. Thank you for letting me know. He didn't expect a response. He got one anyway, 40 seconds later. For what it's worth, the decision to examine the project was made before this week. The documentation issues were identified in routine review. What happened Monday accelerated the timeline. It didn't create the problem. Derek read this several times. He understood what it was telling him. It was telling him that Roman Davel had not constructed a weapon to use against him in response to what happened in the mall. The weapon had already existed. Derek had built it himself, carefully over months, and Roman Davel had simply been in a position to pick it up. He typed back nothing. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking. Zariah was at the community center on West 114th when her phone rang. It was a Wednesday evening. She was there every Wednesday, and she was in the middle of a meeting with a woman named Patrice, who was 44 years old and had been in and out of financial crisis for 6 years and had just gotten her first stable housing placement and was terrified that she was going to lose it for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Zariah knew that terror. She recognized it in the specific way. You recognize things you have lived through, not as an observer recognizing a pattern, but as a body recognizing a sensation. You're not going to lose it, she told Patrice. Not because things won't get hard, they will, but because you've been managing hard things for 6 years without any stability at all, and now you have some. That's an advantage. You just don't believe it yet because you haven't used it yet. Patrice looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted to believe this and was deciding whether she trusted the person, saying it enough to try. Zariah said, I know because I was sitting where you're sitting. When? 7 years ago. Zariah looked at her directly. I had nothing. I had a sick sister, a room I could barely pay for, and a job that wasn't enough. And someone looked at me and made a decision about what I was worth, based on what I looked like and where I'd come from. She paused. They were wrong. That doesn't mean I knew they were wrong right away. It took time to know it in the right part of myself. Patrice was quiet for a moment. How do you know when you know it in the right part? Zariah thought about the mall corridor, about her hands on the gift box, about the tremor in her fingers at the kitchen sink, and Roman's hand over hers on the seat, and Nyla winding the carousel 6 times before bed. You stop needing people who were wrong about you to admit it, she said. You stop wanting the apology, not because you've forgiven them, necessarily, but because their opinion of you stopped being the measure. Patrice looked at the table for a long time. Then she looked up. I'm working on that part, she said. I know, Zariah said. That's enough for today. Her phone had rung during that conversation, and she'd let it go to voicemail. She checked it afterward, standing in the corridor outside the meeting room, coat half on. The voicemail was from a number she didn't recognize. She played it. A man's voice. Controlled but effortful, the way voices sound when someone is being careful. Ms. Monroe, my name is Derek Halston. I know you have no reason to take this call. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I spoke to a regulatory examiner today and told them everything they needed to know. I wanted you to know that separately from however you find out about the rest of it. I also wanted to say that what I said to you on Monday was wrong. Not just the things I said in front of your daughter. All of it. Every assumption I made about who you were and what you deserved. I was wrong about every one of them. A pause. A long one. I don't expect that to matter to you at this point. It probably shouldn't. But I needed to say it. Another pause. That's all. The voicemail ended. Zariah stood in the corridor of the community center, with her coat half on and her phone in her hand, and the sounds of other people's conversations moving around her. A woman laughing in one of the rooms. Someone's kid running down the hallway. The particular noise of a place that had been built to hold people going through difficult things and help them continue. She played the voicemail again. She stood there for a moment after it ended. Then she put her phone in her pocket and finished putting her coat on and walked back into the meeting room because Patrice was still there and they had more to talk about. Roman was on the phone when she got home, standing at the window, the way he often stood when calls required something from him, not pacing, just still, with his weight settled and his voice quiet. He wrapped up the call when he heard her come in and turned around. She took her coat off, hung it up, came into the living room. "He left me a voicemail," she said. Roman said nothing. He apologized. She sat down on the couch. He said he told the examiners everything. He said he was wrong about every assumption he made about me. She looked up. "Did you know he was going to call?" "No." She believed him. "How do I feel about this?" she said. Not to him, exactly. More to the air between them. Roman sat down beside her. He didn't say anything, which was correct, because the question wasn't for him. "Years ago," she said slowly, "I used to think about what it would feel like if he ever said that. If he ever actually looked at me and admitted he was wrong. I thought it would feel like I don't know. Something big. Something that closed something. Does it?" She thought about it. She examined it honestly, the way she always tried to examine things, without the answer she wanted overlaid on the answer that was actually there. "It feels small," she said. "Not nothing, but small." She paused. "Like a door closing in a room I'd already moved out of." Roman looked at her. "That's not cold," she said. "Is that cold?" "No," he said. "That's what moving on actually feels like. People think it feels like triumph. It doesn't. It feels like that." He paused. "Small, and then smaller." She leaned back against the couch. The apartment was quiet. Nyla was at a sleepover. First one she'd ever asked to attend, which had been its own long conversation about trust and distance, and the difference between someone being safe and someone feeling safe. She was at Amara's. She'd called at 8 to say goodnight, and to inform them that they'd eaten an unreasonable amount of pizza, and that Amara loved the carousel music box, and had already wound it 11 times. Zariah closed her eyes. "Roman," she said, "yeah. I don't want this to be the story. Derek and what he lost and what you found, and how it all fell apart for him." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "I don't want that to be what this year is about. It doesn't have to be. I know, but I have to choose that. It doesn't just happen." She paused. "I've been running the community program for 2 years, and I've been treating it like a side project, like something I do in the spaces between the rest of life. I want to expand it. I want to hire someone to actually run the intake process and build out the financial mentorship component and stop doing everything from a folding table on Wednesday evenings." She turned her head to look at him. "I talked to a woman tonight named Patrice, who's been managing impossible things for 6 years and just got stable housing, and she's terrified she'll lose it. There are 100 Patrices. There are 1,000. Roman said, "Tell me what you need. I need to not ask you to fund it." He looked at her. "I know you'd do it," she said. "That's not the point. The point is I need to build it in a way that belongs to itself. That isn't dependent on one source. Grants, community partnerships, private donors who aren't connected to us." She paused. "I want it to stand on its own." Roman was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know someone at the Harlow Foundation. She owes me a conversation. Not money, a conversation, an introduction. The rest you'd build yourself." Zariah thought about it. An introduction was different from funding. An introduction was a door. She could walk through doors herself. "Okay," she said. "Yes." Roman nodded. She looked at the ceiling again. The apartment held the particular quiet of a home where a child usually was, and tonight wasn't slightly louder in its silence than it would have been otherwise. She wound it 11 times, Zariah said. "Amara's carousel." "Our carousel," Roman said. "Amara's just the occasion." Zariah smiled. It was small and involuntary, and she didn't try to contain it. She sat there in the quiet with her husband beside her and the city outside the window, and the story of the last week arranged itself in her mind, not as a victory and not as a defeat, but as a thing that had happened, a thing with texture and cost, and some grief mixed into the relief, the way real things always are. And she felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has come through something that required everything and has discovered that everything, deployed completely, was enough. She was not finished. Patrice needed a follow-up meeting. The program needed a real structure. There was a woman named Dana she'd met 3 months ago who might be right for the intake coordinator role. There was a grant application she'd been meaning to start for 6 weeks. There was a daughter at a sleepover who had wound a music box 11 times. She was not finished. She had, in fact, Only just she had, in fact, only just begun. That was the thought she fell asleep with that night, not triumphant, not neat, just true in the specific way of things that are still in motion. The program, Patrice. The grant application she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks because starting things from scratch required a particular kind of energy and she hadn't been sure she had it. She had it now. She didn't know where it had come from exactly, or whether the week's events had produced it or simply uncovered it. But it was there in the morning when she woke up before the alarm and lay in the dark and felt it, that low, steady hum of someone who has decided what they're doing next. Roman was already up. She could hear him in the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man who makes coffee the same way every morning, the same sequence of motions, the same careful attention to a thing that didn't require careful attention, but got it anyway. She had learned his sounds, the way you learn the sounds of a place you live in long enough. The building's pipes, the specific creak of the third floorboard in the hallway. The way Roman set a mug down, never dropped it, always placed it, like things were worth treating correctly. She lay there for another few minutes, and then she got up. He had coffee ready. He handed it to her without being asked, which was the domestic shorthand of two people who had paid enough attention to each other that asking had become unnecessary for the ordinary things. Nyla calls at 8, he said. I know. She's going to want to tell you about last night in real time, in order, beginning to end. I know that too. He smiled, the small, unguarded one that most people never saw, that he didn't perform for anyone, that existed only in the ordinary moments of his own home. She had been the first person in a long time to see that smile regularly, and she was still, 4 years in, quietly grateful for it. She drank her coffee. I want to call the Harlow Foundation contact today, she said. Miriam Chen. I'll text you her number. I want to make the call myself. I don't want her to know the connection first. I want to pitch it on its own terms and then disclose the connection if it becomes relevant. Roman looked at her over his own mug. That's a harder path. Yes. Okay, he said. He didn't argue it. That was one of the things about him that had taken her the longest to trust, the way he gave her the harder path without requiring her to justify wanting it. He'd grown up in a world where power meant other people did the difficult things for you, and he had made somewhere along the way a conscious decision that the woman he chose to build a life with would not be someone he carried. She had needed to understand that before she could accept it fully, that his willingness to step back was not indifference, but respect. She understood it now. I'm also going to call Donna Reyes, she said. Dana was the woman she'd been thinking about. For the intake coordinator position, early 30s, had worked 3 years at a nonprofit housing organization and 2 years at a financial counseling firm, had the specific combination of empathy and systems thinking that the program needed. I want to have the conversation before I have the budget to make the offer. I want to know if she's interested in principle. What if she says yes, and you can't move fast enough? Then I'll move faster. She set the mug down. I've been waiting until everything was in place before I started. That's not how it works. That's how you wait forever. Roman said nothing, which was agreement. She took her coffee to the study and opened her laptop. Miriam Chen answered her own phone on the third ring, which was apparently a thing that competent women did, Zariah thought, and filed away for no particular reason. She introduced herself by name and told Miriam she was calling about the Harlow Foundation's Community Development Grant Program, and she pitched the program in 4 minutes. Its history, its current structure, the gap it was filling, the specific population it served, and the expansion she was planning. She did not mention Roman. She did not mention her married name. She used her full name, Zariah Monroe, which was the name she'd been building with before everything else entered the picture, and the name she intended to build with after. Miriam Chen listened without interrupting. When Zariah finished, there was a pause. Who referred you to me? Miriam asked. I'd prefer to disclose that after you've heard the pitch on its merits, Zariah said, if that's acceptable. Another pause. Shorter this time. That's an unusual approach. I'm aware. Most people lead with their connections. I know. I've decided my connections aren't the point. Miriam Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the expansion you're describing, the intake coordinator position, and the financial mentorship component, that's closer to what we fund at the mid-tier grant level, which requires a site visit and a full application package. The timeline is usually 8 to 12 weeks. Zariah said, I can have a preliminary package ready in 3 weeks. That's fast. I've been running the program for 2 years. The documentation exists. I need to shape it into the right format. All right, Miriam said. Send me a preliminary overview. 2 pages. Program history, population served, expansion plan, projected budget. If the overview is strong, I'll schedule a site visit. A pause. And Ms. Monroe the referral? Zariah said. Roman Davel. The pause this time was longer. I see, Miriam said. Then, with the careful professional neutrality of someone who has just recalibrated something internally and is not going to show it, the work still has to stand on its own. That's exactly what I told him when I asked for the introduction, Zariah said. Miriam Chen said, 3 weeks, 2 pages. I look forward to reading it. She hung up. Zariah sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Her heart was going slightly faster than normal, not from fear, from the specific physical sensation of having done something that required courage and having it go as well as it could go, which was not the same as it going easily. Her hands were steady. She was glad about that. She opened a new document. She started typing. The formal regulatory findings on Meridian Harbor were released 6 weeks later, not publicly, not as a press statement, but as a documented determination, communicated to the involved parties and to the institutional investors who had been in the review process. The language was precise and measured and said, in the particular careful vocabulary of regulatory bodies, that the project's financial documentations contained material misrepresentations that rendered the proposed investment structurally unsound and that a formal examination had been referred to the appropriate authority. Gerald Fitch resigned from the approval board the same day. He released a statement through an attorney that said he accepted full responsibility for his role and was cooperating completely with all ongoing proceedings, which was the statement of a man who had been told clearly and specifically that complete cooperation was the only option that produced any outcome other than the worst one. Marcus Webb's bar inquiry was opened the following week. His firm placed him on administrative leave while the inquiry proceeded, which was the firm's way of protecting itself, while appearing to handle the situation responsibly, which was what firms did. Holston Development filed for restructuring 3 weeks after the regulatory determination. Derek had known it was coming. Harriet Sloan had walked him through the timeline in their first meeting, had told him to prepare himself for it not as a surprise, but as a sequence, each event following the previous one, with the logic of dominoes, but knowing it was coming didn't change what it felt like when the filing was made, and the news moved through his professional network in the specific way that professional networks moved bad news, which was fast and thorough and without particular mercy. He had been told about it by a junior analyst at his own firm, a 26-year-old, who clearly didn't know how to deliver the information and had chosen to send a text, which Derek had actually appreciated because a text required nothing from him in terms of visible reaction. He sat in the office he was about to vacate and looked at the text and thought about what Harriet Sloan had said about consequence, about the difference between shaping it and erasing it. The restructuring was shaped. It was not the worst version. He still had his personal assets, most of them, in the form they'd been in before Meridian Harbor, which was substantial, because he had been good at making money before he'd decided to also be good at cutting corners. What he didn't have was the company in its current form, or his position in the investment community, or the version of himself he'd been presenting for 15 years. He looked around the office. He thought, unexpectedly, about Zariah's face in the mall corridor when she'd picked up the damaged gift box. The way she'd checked its corners, pressed the bent edge back into shape, and then stood up and met his eyes without heat. Just steadiness. The specific steadiness of someone who has survived worse and knows it. He had read that steadiness in the moment as limitation, as resignation, as the flat affect of someone who had given up. He understood now that it was the opposite. That it was what people looked like when they had stopped needing external confirmation of their own worth. That it took more, not less, to arrive at that than anything he had built. He packed the things from his desk that were personal and left the things that belonged to the company. He walked out without saying goodbye to anyone, which was not because he was avoiding them, but because there was genuinely nothing to see that wouldn't be inadequate. And inadequacy had been a problem he'd had for long enough. Camille came back. Not immediately, and not entirely. That would have been a different story than the one that was actually happening. She came back in the partial, provisional way of someone who is still deciding, who has decided to stay close enough to keep deciding, rather than making the final call from a distance. She came back to the apartment, and they had 2 dinners that were careful, and one conversation was not careful at all. That was the kind of conversation that happened late at night when carefulness runs out, and what's left is just 2 people saying what they actually thought. She said, "I don't know if I can trust what I'm seeing right now. I don't know if this is who you are, or who you become under pressure." He said, "I don't know either." She looked at him. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 7 months." She said, "I know. What happens when the pressure's gone?" She wasn't being cruel. She was being specific, the way she was when she was frightened of something, and addressing the fear directly instead of around it. What happens when things stabilize and it's just ordinary life again? Which person shows up? Derek said, "I don't know. I know which person I want to show up." "That's not the same." "No," he said, "it's not." They sat with that for a while. "I'm not leaving," she said finally. "I'm also not pretending this didn't happen. I'm not going to make it smaller than it is so we can both be comfortable." She picked up her wine glass. "I need to see who you are on an ordinary Tuesday. When there's nothing at stake and no examiner in a conference room and no consequences bearing down. Just an ordinary Tuesday." "That's fair," he said. "It's going to take a while, I know." She looked at him across the table in the apartment that was quieter than it used to be, with fewer people moving through it and fewer events scheduled and fewer reasons to perform anything for anyone. And she said, "I'm still angry at you." "I know." "Good," she said. "Don't try to fix that part. Let me be angry." He didn't try to fix it. That was new, too. Zariah was in the community center on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks after the mall when Patrice walked in carrying a folder. The folder contained a bank statement, a lease renewal notice, and a pay stub from a job she'd started 3 weeks earlier, administrative assistant at a medical office, 32 hours a week, enough to cover her rent with room for a modest emergency fund. She set the folder on the table between them and sat down and looked at it, and then looked at Zariah. "I wanted you to see it," she said, in person. Zariah opened the folder. She looked at the documents. The bank balance was not large. It was the bank balance of someone who was at the beginning of a stable thing, rather than anywhere near the middle or end. But it was positive. It was consistent. It was real. "This is good work," Zariah said. "It doesn't feel like enough. It never does at the beginning. That's normal." Zariah closed the folder and slid it back across the table. What it feels like at the beginning is not a reliable indicator of what it is. Patrice looked at the folder. How long before it feels like something? Zariah thought about it honestly. For me, it was about a year before I stopped waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I was about to lose everything, even when I had enough. The anxiety doesn't disappear when the situation changes. It takes longer than that. "A year," Patrice said, "give or take. And it's not a clean line. There are weeks that are harder than others even inside the good stretch." She paused. "But the good stretch gets longer. That's what changes." Patrice nodded slowly. "I told my daughter about the program," she said. "She's 22. She's in a bad situation, different kind, but bad. She asked if she could come." Zariah said, "Bring her Wednesday after next. I want to meet her." Patrice looked at her with the expression of someone who is not yet accustomed to things working out, who is still slightly braced for the revision. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Zariah said. "That's what we're here for." Dana Reyes was at the intake table across the room she'd started 3 weeks ago, officially, once the preliminary Harlow grant had come through as a bridge, while the full application was in process. She was talking to a woman Zariah didn't recognize, leaning forward with her elbows on the table and her whole attention on what the woman was saying. And Zariah watched her for a moment and felt something she recognized as relief. The specific relief of a person who has found someone they can trust to do something they couldn't do alone. The program had 17 active participants now. 3 weeks ago it had had 9. The grant application was complete. Miriam Chen had done the site visit, had walked through the community center on a Tuesday afternoon, and asked questions that were specific and sometimes difficult, and had not visibly adjusted her assessment based on anything other than the answers. She had stayed 45 minutes longer than scheduled. She had shaken Zariah's hand at the end and said, with the restrained warmth of a professional who chose her words carefully. I think this is exactly what the mid-tier program is meant to support. She had not said it was a sure thing. She hadn't needed to. Zariah was not waiting for the confirmation to keep moving. She had relearned, more precisely, because she'd always known this and had needed the reminder that waiting for certainty before proceeding was how you stayed still. She was not staying still. Nyla's birthday was in March, 8 months after the mall, which meant she was turning 9, and she informed Zariah and Roman with significant advance notice that she wanted a party with a specific theme that changed 3 times in 6 weeks before settling. Finally, on a carnival theme, because she had seen a picture of one and decided that was the correct choice. They had it in the community room of a family center, two blocks from their building. Roman's people set it up, had watched with amusement as 3 men who were accustomed to arranging things of considerably higher stakes devoted their full competence to the hanging of paper lanterns and the assembly of a ring toss game. Roman himself had hung the banner, twice, because the first time it was slightly uneven, and Nyla had pointed this out. Amara came with her mother. 7 other children came, which was 4 more than had been invited to Nyla's class birthday acknowledgement the year before, when she had still been the quiet new girl who didn't quite know how to occupy a room. She knew now. She occupied this particular room with complete authority, directing the ring toss, negotiating the rules of a game she was inventing in real time, explaining to Amara's mother with earnest patience the correct way to hang a paper streamer. Zariah stood at the edge of the room and watched her. Roman came to stand beside her. He was holding 2 paper cups of juice because someone had handed them to him as he passed the drink table, and he had taken them the way he took most things, without ceremony. He held one out. She took it. They stood there, watching Nyla explain streamer hanging technique to a woman who had about 15 years and 60 pounds on her, and was listening with complete seriousness. "She's going to be a problem," Roman said. "She already is a problem. A good problem. The best kind," Zariah said. Amara ran past them in the direction of the ring toss, laughing at something Nyla had said from across the room, and Nyla laughed back a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a child who is not monitoring the room for threats, and Zariah watched that laugh, and felt the thing she sometimes felt when Nyla was like this, which was a complicated gratitude that contained grief inside it, because Nyla should have always been able to laugh like that, and she hadn't always been able to. And the fact that she could now didn't erase the fact that she couldn't before. You held both. That was what you did. You held the grief for what was lost and the gratitude for what was here, and you didn't try to resolve them into each other because they weren't the same thing, and pretending they were was dishonest. Roman put his hand on the back of her neck, briefly, lightly. Just there for a moment, and then gone. The same way he touched her, sometimes not possession, just presence. "I'm here, I see what you're looking at." She leaned her shoulder against his for a moment. Then Nyla spotted them from across the room and pointed at them with the imperious authority of a birthday child. "Come play," she said, "both of you." They went to play. The night after the party, after Nyla was asleep, with the noise and sugar and celebration metabolized into the deep unconsciousness of a thoroughly spent child, Zariah sat on the floor of the study with the grant application printout spread around her and a yellow legal pad in her lap. She was writing notes for the second phase, the one that came after the Harlow grant, assuming it came through, which she was planning for rather than assuming, because there was a difference. The second phase was bigger. It required a second staff member, a partnership with 2 other organizations, and a physical expansion of the intake space. She had been thinking about it for weeks and was now putting it on paper in the specific way of someone who has moved from thinking to doing the lists, the timelines, the questions that didn't have answers yet, but needed to be visible so they could be worked toward. Roman came and looked at the paper spread around her. He sat down on the floor beside her, without comment, not across from her, at the desk, not in the chair, on the floor, which was slightly impractical for a man his size, and looked at the legal pad. "Second phase," he said. "If the first one works." "When," he said. She looked at him. "When the first one works," he said. "Not if." She thought about arguing the distinction and then decided against it. He wasn't being reckless. He was applying the specific confidence of someone who had looked at the first phase and made an assessment, and was stating the assessment honestly. She had learned to distinguish that from false reassurance. When, she said. He looked at the legal pad, at the notes and the questions and the numbers that didn't add up yet. What's the hardest part of the second phase? The physical space. Expanding the intake room requires either the center giving us more square footage, which means negotiating with them, or finding a separate location, which means a lease and utilities, and it's the hardest thing to fund because it's physical infrastructure and grants favor programming over space. What does the center want in exchange for more space? She thought about it. I haven't asked yet. I've been assuming they'd want something I couldn't give. Ask, he said. I know. Sometimes people want less than you think. He looked at the paper. And sometimes they want something you have. You won't know until you ask. She wrote ask, center Z, space on the legal pad, which she had probably already written somewhere, but writing it again made it more real, in the specific way that writing things down made them more real. Roman, she said, yeah. She looked at the papers around her, the application, the notes, the numbers, the questions, and then she looked at him, sitting on the floor of the study in the home they'd built together, unguarded in the way he was only unguarded here. When you walked into that mall, she said, what were you thinking? In the moment before you saw me. He considered it. He was honest with it, the way he was honest when he took the question seriously. I was thinking about what my man had described on the phone. Someone blocking your path, touching property that belonged to Nyla. A pause. I was thinking about getting to you. Were you angry? Yes, at him? At the situation? At the fact that you were in it? He looked at the wall. I've been in a lot of situations in my life where anger was useful, where it served a function. This was different. This was, I just needed to get to you, and then figure out what was needed. And what did you figure out? That you didn't need me to do anything. You'd already handled it. He looked back at her. What you needed was for someone to be standing beside you when you stood back up. That's a different thing from rescuing someone. She looked at him. I know the difference, he said. I needed to learn it, but I know it. She did know he knew it. That was the thing about Roman. He had come from a world where power meant doing things for people, and he had learned, in their years together, that the person she was didn't need things done for her. She needed someone to understand what she was doing and stand beside her while she did it. That had required more from him than the other thing would have. She knew that. She reached over and put her hand on his. They sat there in the papers on the floor of the study, the apartment quiet around them. Nyla's asleep down the hall, the city outside the window doing what it always did, moving, enormous, indifferent, and also, somehow, still there, regardless. I want to say something, she said, and I want to say it once, and then I don't want to talk about it again. Okay. What he said. In the mall. About you being behind me before he'd respect me. She had been carrying this one piece for weeks. Not the sting of it, the question inside it. There's a version of the story where that's true. Where none of it means anything without you behind it. Where everything I've built is just borrowed power. She paused. I've been thinking about that. Roman was quiet. And I've decided it's not true, she said. Not because I want it to not be true. Because I can point to the actual evidence. The program existed before you. Patrice existed before you. The Wednesday evenings and the folding table and the 17 women existed before anyone knew I was connected to you. She paused. The Harlow application I made on my own terms. Dana I hired on my own judgment. The second phase. I'm planning without your money. She looked at him. What you gave me is not the work. What you gave me is you stood next to me. That's not nothing. That's a real thing. But it's not the work. No, Roman said. It's not. The work is mine. It always was. She looked at their hands, hers on his. She said. She picked up the legal pad. She kept writing. Derek Halston did not disappear. He had thought, in the worst weeks after the restructuring, that he might not literally, but in the professional sense, the way people in his world disappeared when they lost the position and the company and the social credibility that had made them legible. He had thought he would become invisible in the specific way of people who no longer serve a function in the rooms they used to occupy. He did not entirely disappear. What happened was slower and stranger than disappearance. He became a different kind of person in the same city. He took a consulting role with a smaller firm, operational rather than strategic, work that required knowledge rather than profile. He went to fewer dinners. He stopped attending the kind of events he used to attend primarily to be seen. He called his mother for the first time in 8 months, and then again 2 weeks later, and then he started calling her regularly, which was something he had been planning to do for approximately 5 years, and had not done because there was always something more urgent. His mother told him, on the third call, that he sounded different. He said, "Different how?" She said, "Quieter. Less like you're trying to convince me of something." He thought about that for a long time. He and Camille were still navigating the ordinary Tuesday problem, the question of who he was when there was nothing at stake. Some ordinary Tuesdays were better than others. He was learning to sit with the ones that weren't, which was harder than the work Harriet Sloan had helped him do in the conference room, in some ways, because there was no structure for it, and no professional guiding the process. Just two people in an apartment, trying to figure out if they were building something that could hold. He did not call Zariah again. He had said what he needed to say. She had received it or not received it. He didn't know which, and didn't feel he had the right to ask. He had no claim on her response or her forgiveness or her attention. What he had done was make the amends that were in his power to make, and then remove himself from the equation, which was the correct and only decent thing. He thought about her sometimes, about the specific look on her face in the mall corridor, and about the word she'd used when he'd asked, in that first voicemail not asked, stated that he'd been wrong. He saw what you never could. He turned that over periodically, not in the way of a wound, but in the way of a lesson that still had things in it. He had spent 15 years deciding what people were worth, based on how they looked and where they'd come from, and how useful they could be to the version of himself he was constructing. He had made those decisions with full confidence in his own accuracy. He had been wrong about Zariah Monroe in every particular. He was probably wrong about other people too. He didn't know who yet. He was working on learning to hold that not knowing without immediately filling it in with another certainty. It was hard. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, harder than the conference room and harder than the restructuring, because it was internal and had no external measure of completion, and might, honestly, never be fully done. He was trying anyway. That was what he had. The Harlow grant came through on a Thursday, April mid-morning, an email that Zariah almost missed because she was on a call with the director of one of the partner organizations she was building the second phase around. She saw the subject line and said to the director, "I'm sorry, I have to call you back," and hung up and sat very still for a moment before opening the email. She read it twice. Then she called Roman. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, the grant came through." A pause. Not surprised he had told her, when not if but something in his voice that she recognized as the particular warmth of someone who has been watching a person they love work towards something and is watching it arrive. "Full amount," he said. "Full amount, 18-month term, with a renewal pathway if the metrics are met." She was reading as she spoke, her eyes moving over the email. Miriam wrote a note at the bottom. She said the application was one of the strongest in the mid-tier category this cycle. Roman said nothing for a moment. "Roman, I heard you. Say something." "I told you when," he said. She laughed. It came out slightly ragged at the edges, the laugh of someone who has been holding their breath for a while and has just been permitted to breathe. She put her hand over her eyes, not crying, just kneading the dark behind her palm. For a second, the small private moment of someone processing something real. She took her hand away. "I have to call Dana," she said. "Call Dana and the center director about the space. Call the center director, and I have to tell Nyla. Call Nyla last," he said. "You'll be on the phone for an hour." She laughed again, steadier this time. She was already standing, already moving toward the desk, already making the first of the calls in her head. "I'll see you tonight." "Tonight," he said. She hung up. She called Dana first, then the center director, then 2 of the partner organizations, then her contact at the second partner, then a woman named Grace, who had been a participant 18 months ago and had completed the program and had asked 3 months ago whether there was any way she could volunteer. Zariah had been waiting until she had something concrete to offer. She had something concrete now. Grace said yes before Zariah finished asking. She called Nyla last. Nyla said, at the end of the explanation, with the thoughtful seriousness she applied to things she was genuinely considering, "So more people can come to the Wednesday thing?" "Yes, a lot more. Like Patrice? Like Patrice." Good, Nyla said. Patrice is nice. She remembered my name the second time she saw me. Lots of adults don't do that. Zariah sat with that for a moment, the specific detail her daughter had noticed and held on to, the precise thing that had mattered to her. A woman who remembered her name. Small things. The accumulation of small things. You're right, Zariah said. Lots of adults don't do that. You do, Nyla said. I try. You don't just try. You actually do it. Nyla's voice was matter-of-fact, the way she was matter-of-fact about things she was certain of. There's a difference. Zariah sat at her desk in the quiet of the study, the grant letter open on her screen, the legal pad with the second phase notes on the desk beside her. The city outside the window in the particular late afternoon, light of an April Thursday, that had no idea it was significant, and was being significant anyway. She thought about who she had been 7 years ago, the woman in the room she could barely pay for, with the dying sister and the not-enough job, and the boyfriend who had looked at her and made his assessment and found her wanting. She thought about what that woman would have believed if someone had told her where she would be on an April Thursday 7 years later. She probably wouldn't have believed it, not because it was impossible, but because the woman she'd been then had not yet understood that the thing Derek had seen as her ceiling was actually just his imagination, and that she had never been required to live inside it. She had taken a long time to fully understand that. She understood it now. Not in the triumphant way of someone who has won something and wants the person who doubted her to see it. In the quieter way of someone who has arrived at a place that was always there, always waiting, and simply needed her to keep moving long enough to reach it. She was Zariah Monroe Davil. She was a plus-size black woman who had buried her sister and raised her sister's daughter and rebuilt everything from a room she could barely pay for. She was the woman who had stopped in a rainstorm and given her coat to a stranger and told another stranger, standing uselessly in the rain, to either help or move. She was the woman who had stood in a marble corridor with a crushed birthday present and a frightened child and had not broken, and who had gone home afterward and sat on the kitchen floor with a legal pad and started planning the next thing. She was not finished. She picked up her pen. She kept going.